So you want to read the classics, but so far you've found them pretty much really uninteresting, you lack political and historical context, and frankly you find them quite boring. Well friends, you've come to the right place. I'm Aisling, and generally I read a little bit of everything, but the classics are something that I tend to stray away from. But today I'm going to suggest to you 10 classics that I found actually to be quite readable and even quite enjoyable. So my number one top tip for actually being able to read the classics is to read the modern classics, because as the name suggests, they're quite modern. They tend to have been written in the mid 20th century, a time which a lot of us will generally understand the majority of the context and the history. And so I'm going to suggest these classics in the order that they were written in, from most recent to way back in time. So first things first, as I suggested, I'm going to start with a modern classic, and we're going all the way to Norway, and I'm going to suggest The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas. I really should have looked up how to pronounce that name before I tried to pronounce it on camera and failed drastically yet again. But anyway, we're starting out just 61 years ago. So this book was published in 1963. We follow two young girls, Sis and An, and they are two friends who have actually only really spent one evening outside of school in each other's company. But this evening had such a profound impact on them both that when An inexplicably and unexpectedly disappears, Sis's world is absolutely shattered. It's a really short one. It reads quite strangely, but something about this book is incredibly interesting and captivating. I won't give too much away because it's such a short book, but I will say the writing is really lyrical, really captivating. It very much falls into the literary sphere, but as I mentioned, it is quite strange. I read it quite some time ago, but it's definitely one that I still think about very often. Next up then we have another modern classic in the form of Shirley Jackson, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And this one was published just a year before The Ice Palace in 1962. So we follow Merricat, and she lives in a large house with her sister Constance and her uncle. 7 Blackwoods used to live in this house, but something happened one night. The sugar bowl happened to have been laced with arsenic, which killed 4 members of their family. It was Merricat's sister Constance who was responsible for serving dinner and dessert that night, so generally people do blame Constance, but Constance was acquitted of the murders, but there was never actually any other culprit brought to justice. They live on the edge of a small town, and as a result of this, the Blackwoods, Merricat, Constance and their uncle Julian are very much ostracised, very much spoken about in negative ways, and the people of the town are quite cruel to them. The interactions between the characters feel really strange and almost dreamlike. It winded up for me reading almost like a fairy tale, which is quite unusual because there's no magic or anything else fantastical of the sort. This is yet another book within which the house feels very much like a character in the novel, which is something that I absolutely always seem to adore. It's another very short one. It's another quite strange one, but the language is really accessible. It's very easy to read. If you want to read a classic and you're not sure where to start, I think this is a very good one. I'd also suggest The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, which is another modern classic, and it has been brought to fame by its Netflix series. The series itself is very different from the book. The series is quite scary and the book isn't. It's just very strange and a little bit creepy. If you're very worried about reading scary books, don't be. It's quite accessible. It's a little bit creepy, I will say, but it's very readable as well, and for me personally, I found it to be another very enjoyable read. We're moving back a few decades now, friends, but we're still in the 20th century. The next book then that I'm going to recommend is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So this book is a book that reads very gothic. There have been some films made of this story as well. It's quite a well-known story, but it was one that I knew very little about when I went into it, and I will say I am very glad that I read it. So we open up in Monte Carlo, where we meet our unnamed protagonist, and she's there working as a companion of a wealthy older woman. This wealthy woman is constantly trying to befriend the other people in the hotel that they're staying in, people who are probably a little bit higher in status than she is, and she can be quite embarrassing and quite forceful, and our protagonist generally doesn't want to spend too much time with her. They meet a man named Maxim de Winter, and he has recently been bereaved. His wife died the year previously. He's brooding, he's quite inaccessible, he's a man of means, and his home Manderley is one that's definitely on the map and quite well known back in England. The older woman comes down with a bout of the flu, so our protagonist ends up taking some trips with Maxim de Winter, and when it's time for them to leave, he decides to propose marriage to our young protagonist and to take her back to Manderley with him. The new couple enjoy their honeymoon, but it's when they get back to Manderley that the cracks really begin to show. So Manderley is again a house that's very much a character in this novel. The staff in the house all knew and loved Maxim's ex-wife Rebecca, who has only died the year previously, and our protagonist finds it really difficult to fit in and to be accepted, and she doesn't really understand her new status as wife of Mr. de Winter. The echoes of Rebecca are everywhere and it's quite stifling, the atmosphere is quite claustrophobic, and it feels a little bit uneasy and just slightly creepy without being scary. What follows is a really strange and wonderfully written story about a young woman who is really unsure and lonely and who's left aloft and floating in a world that she's incredibly unfamiliar with. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed this book, but I found it to be really accessible, really readable, and one that I would absolutely suggest picking up. We're still in the 1930s then, we're in 1937, and I'm going to suggest Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So this was my very first Steinbeck novel, and actually probably one of the very first classics that I actually properly enjoyed, that when I finished and put it down I thought, wow, that was really good. That was something that really surprised me, and it's one that I remember quite clearly, even though I probably read it in my late teens if not my early 20s. So we are set in California for this one, and we're following an unlikely friendship between two characters. So they're both labourers in California's dusty crop fields. George is described as small and quick, whereas Lenny is huge, really imposing, but is described as having the mind of a child. They cling together, living hand to mouth, but they've always had a plan to own their own land with a little cottage that they can call their own. I remember feeling incredibly emotionally drained after having read this one, but to me usually that's a sign of a really good book. They live in a world of such chronic misunderstanding and jealousy and just overall callousness, but there's something so wonderful about this friendship, and it has made both of their lives incredibly meaningful. We're moving back into the 1920s now with A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. So this is one that absolutely didn't appeal to me for a really long time, but eventually I just decided to pick it up and give it a go anyway. We follow an American ambulance driver who is driving on the front of the Italian War. We witness his passion for a beautiful English nurse, and this is where the story really gets going. So this is said to be a semi-autobiographical work, and through this story we witness the harsh realities of war and how that affects the people that are unwittingly caught up in it. It can be at times really tender, but we are set against the backdrop of the battlefield, and the juxtaposition works beautifully. Hemingway is said to have rewritten the ending of this book 39 times to get it right, and it's certainly an ending that I won't forget in a hurry. I found the language to be really accessible, and I was absolutely swept along in the current of the story and didn't find myself caught up, confused or lost at any time. And still we're in the 1920s, and we have the infamous The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. First things first, this was a novel I just decided to try because it was so short, and I thought that might make it very readable. And yes, it helped, but also this book is actually a really great book. We're set in the Jazz Age and we follow the incredibly wealthy Jay Gatsby. This is a story essentially of lavish parties on Long Island. Gatsby is in love with the unattainable Daisy. It's really lush, it's also quite strange, it's quite dark, and I found it to be quite fast-paced as well. We're told this story by our narrator Nick Carraway, who lives next door to Gatsby and who has a very unique perspective as a spectator of this tale. There's very much a conflict between illusion and reality throughout this story. There's so much about dreams of wealth that really fueled America at this time, and the influence in general that money just had on people overall. It's also about the ludicrous things that we'll do for love and how that might potentially lead leave us with a little less or more than we might have bargained for. The writing is really interesting, the language is subtle, and there's so much here that's suggested but never actually said. It's a really interesting character study, and as I've mentioned, it's very short. Again, it's one that I didn't expect to enjoy, but friends, I absolutely loved this one. And as recommendations go, this is one that would be close to the top of some of my all-time favorites. And then we're moving back into the 19th century to a story that we all feel like we know, but actually, do you? So this one was published in 1897, and it's a very, very famous story, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So interestingly, Bram Stoker was actually born in Ireland, and for some reason I didn't know that until I read this book. The impact of this book has been so huge. We all know there have been so many films, so many books, just so many stories in general based on Dracula, based on vampires. We follow a man named Jonathan Harker as he travels to Transylvania to help Count Dracula in the purchase of a London home. But quickly we learn that something very strange is going on, and we follow a series of really bizarre events unfolding. This is an epistolary novel, so we follow the story through letters, through journal entries, things like that, and it's a novel that focuses a lot on themes of masculinity, which of course is seen as vital for the success of the mission. The men in this story achieve self-validation through their acts of protecting the women. It absolutely was not the story that I thought I knew. It wasn't the story that I was expecting, having assumed that I knew what it would be about. It's so strange and unsettling, and I'm delighted to say that it's a classic that stuck with me for a very long time. I didn't find it scary like I expected to. I just found it really engrossing and captivating. I very much believe that there is a solid reason, or a lot of solid reasons, for the notoriety of this book. And then we're back to 1890, and the next book that I'm going to suggest is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So this is Oscar Wilde's first and only published novel, and this is the story about how a young man manages to sell his soul for eternal youth and beauty. Our protagonist Dorian Gray manages to strike this deal, and a portrait that he's had painted of himself instead begins to bear the physical manifestations of Gray's increasing debauchery and criminality, while Gray himself remains young and beautiful. The characters here are really multifaceted, and it feels like an examination of humanity and our struggles with and drive for vanity. I had no idea what to expect going into this one, but it's such a wonderfully written gothic tale, and it feels so incredibly unique, quite easy to read in spite of its age, and one that I'd recommend to those of us who are indeed quite intimidated at the idea of reading classics. Again, another really short one. Next up then, and you're gonna have to hear me out because I'm gonna pick up this book and you're gonna say, no. First things first, we're back to 1867, and whoa, this book is heavy. I'm gonna suggest that you give this book a go, and that book is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And this is not such a short book. I feel like this book is notorious not for its contents, but for its sheer size and number of pages. So my edition has over 1200 pages. And friends, I will say that this is definitely the most difficult book to read out of all of these, not just for its length, but also for its context, its history, its politics. I knew nothing about the Napoleonic Wars. I knew nothing about Napoleon's invasion to Russia, and maybe that was to my detriment, but also maybe it helped me on my way with this book because I didn't get bogged down in things like that. I read them, didn't understand some of it, and just discarded it. But behind all of this politics, behind all of this history, and behind all of this stuff that I found a little bit difficult, was this really epic tale that I absolutely adored. I took my time with this one. It took me about 3 months to actually finish this book, but it was such a great experience. At the beginning of the year, I like to kick off my reading year reading a really long book, and last year in 2023 I decided to give this one a go, and I'm really glad that I did. This book largely focuses on Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, and we follow multiple perspectives throughout this book. We have Pierre, who is the illegitimate son of a count, and he finds himself fighting for his inheritance while also yearning for spiritual and religious fulfillment. We also have the wonderful Prince Andrei, who leaves his family behind as he heads for the front of the war to fight against Napoleon. And then of course we have Natasha Rostov, who was easily my favourite character in this book. She's the beautiful young daughter of a nobleman, and she finds herself a woman of interest to the two men that I've mentioned previously. We follow people from all walks of life and all different backgrounds, peasants, nobility, soldiers, civilians, and we get a really unique insight into this era and into their culture. The characters really come alive here, and by the end I was wholly invested in them and their development. As I've mentioned, I did go into this book without much knowledge of any sort of context, historical, political, just anything at all, and literally knew nothing about the Napoleonic invasion, which probably did go against me a little in the beginning. But if I can read and love this book coming from such sparse foundations, and as somebody who tires of difficult language, of boring books, of classics in general, I believe if I can read it and love it, then it's one that anybody can read and love. It's absolutely worth it. It is quite intimidating, but just like any other book, you just read one page at a time. And then last but absolutely not least, we have a novel that was published in 1818, and that was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, a book that we have all heard of, and like Dracula, we probably all think that we know how this story is going to go. But actually, friends, I was quite surprised and delighted to realise that I knew pretty much nothing about this story. So this is a really wonderful and engaging example of a very early sci-fi novel. This is the story of a scientist who creates a monster. We all know that much. So it is a story that we think we all know, but trust me readers, if you haven't read this book, you can't assume to know or understand the plot. It's really beautifully written and forces you to slow down and just take the story in. It is over 200 years old, but it does read quite accessibly. The language is very readable, and again, it's not a very long one. There are so many themes executed and at play throughout this novel, and it really makes you question who the monster in the story actually is. I was really surprised by this one. It felt so much more modern than it actually is. I genuinely loved it. And so friends, if like me you feel really intimidated and really shy about picking up classics, these are ones that I would genuinely suggest giving a go. Most of them, bar War and Peace, are quite short and really actually quite accessible. I have tried a lot of classics, trust me. I really disliked a lot of the really popular classics such as Pride and Prejudice. I'm sorry to say it, don't cancel me, but it's true. If like me you do struggle with classics, give some of these a go, especially modern classics. They tend to read much more modern, as the name suggests. So let me know if there are any classics that you absolutely love, or any classics that you would suggest to me as somebody who struggles with them. If you've gotten this far and want to leave a comment but don't know what to leave me a little vampire emoji this week in honor of Dracula. If you want to see more from me, don't forget to subscribe. And otherwise friends, I'm going to leave you to it, and I will catch you next week in another video. Bye bye.